Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for this presentation. My name is Pierre. I'm a senior cybersecurity researcher for Kaspersky, and I'm Ivan Kwiatkowski. I'm also a researcher at Kaspersky. We're working on APTs, sophisticated attacks, and I would like to talk with you about SolarWinds. We'll break down the presentation in two parts. First, we'll talk about the way the attack unfolded, and then we'll talk about the aftermath that is less known. I'd like to tell you a couple of things about our team. 40 to 50 researchers across the globe. How do we operate? We're working in a similar fashion to intelligence agencies. We can work with clues that appear in telemetry, information that are communicated by partners. There can be different publications that allow us to kickstart an investigation. Once we have this starting point, we carry out telemetric research. We analyze the data that we've uncovered. We could analyze the victims, the way the attackers circulate their attacks, etc., etc. When we have a proper vision of the attackers, we set up new detection methods internally in order to feed into our knowledge base and gain access to novel information that we derive from these initial items. Once our outlook is comprehensive enough in terms of the attacker's activities, we draft reports and send them to our clients. And the clients who read the reports then have a better idea if the groups whose MO we describe can target them. We also publish information on our own blog, and then we go back to the beginning and we search for a new clue and we launch a new cycle of investigation. A quick precision. So we have 40 people across the globe, 4 in France, among them 3 francophones, and 2 of these 3 people are in front of you, sitting at this table. So I'd like to talk about the inception of the SolarWinds attack. And I'd like to draw your attention on a few technical points, as well as other points. How did we uncover the SolarWinds attack? This may seem anecdotal, but it is an interesting item. In the US, when you have a security incident, it's quite difficult to know to whom you must send a notification. It depends on the branch, it depends on whether or not the attack impacts bank cards or ministries. But in the case of the SolarWinds attacks, the Senate had to look at a 2012 draft bill pertaining to making mandatory the notification of such incidents. I believe, however, that we need a new entity in the US to ensure this notification. So this is a very complicated situation. However, there's something you don't trifle with in the US. It's the market and the investors. So besides our usual considerations, we have the market control authorities that had said that these incidents should be notified to investors or potential investors. If that hadn't been the case, well, it could be thought that some incidents were dissimulated in order to not discourage investments. So it's the SEC who takes care of this, of ensuring that incidents are notified. So FireEye is the first whistleblower that tells the SEC that there is an incident. So FireEye at this point at this moment in time, only declares what falls in his scope, but is maybe aware of how the issue unfolded. And then SolarWinds declares the incident on December the 14th, and FireEye did it on December the 8th. So SolarWinds said it wasn't aware of this attack before December the 12th. So these declarations teach us two things. They will remain unchanged. So SolarWinds says that this attack is a very sophisticated attack that is probably the result of state measures, and 33,000 actors were impacted by the attack. Let's look at the issue itself. So the problem is that we have a breach in the assembly chain of Orion. So the updates of the Orion software were infected. So they deliver the update, but they also deliver a malware. So Orion is a software that is installed in the scope of the organization, and Orion has access to quite a large perimeter at the client's company. Orion is a global leader. SolarWinds has hundreds of thousands of clients at the time being, and a number of them are major organizations as well as institutions in the US. So the Sunburst trap is remarkably integrated in one of the software libraries of Orion, whose code is regularly executed once Orion is used. So this routine was modified. Just a dozen of code lines were modified in order to execute another routine. And this code was written and respected scrupulously the way the SolarWinds code was written. So if you look at these lines of code, they really look like original code from SolarWinds. Before we delve into the technical details, what's an attack on a value creation chain? So there was a presentation at the FIC a few years ago, and that person said that this kind of attack would be more frequent in the future. So this is a kind of attack that is an attack on the chain of trust. So it's about attacking a software company that has a number of different components. And once these different components of the software company are assembled, they are digitally signed. Once they are ready to be deployed and transferred to the clients, they are deployed and transferred to final clients. However, so we have the final users here. If there's an attacker that can meddle on this phase, it could modify some code and make this impossible to identify. He could modify some elements that would be hard to detect. And these modifications will then be circulated among final users. So this is a rather dangerous attack. By attacking a single corporation, you can impact all the final users. So one single breach can cause thousands of victims. So this is a very dangerous type of attack. So these supply chain attacks are quite frequent. There's NotPetya in 2017, where updates for Ukrainian accounting software were modified in order to circulate a malware, and they were at first mistaken with a ransomware, and they thought it was a sabotage attack. This was quite a sophisticated attack because this fake ransomware had automatic replication capacities thanks to a breach called Eternal Blue. So this pseudo ransomware could multiply in the network and infect a huge number of machines. And this attack was known as the most costly attack ever carried out. We also had the shadow pad attack in 2017 with the CCleaner and Net Sarang. We also had a shadow hammer attack in 2018 and 2019 on Asus via video games. There was also a campaign called Cloud Oper, which was attributed to PT10. The US government officially attributed this attack to Chinese services. So this attack did not focus on supply chain softwares, but MSPs. So these cyber attackers attacked MSPs in order to circulate the malware on the client's machines. So it's not the same target, but it's the same concept. With the SolarWinds, the supply chain attack was put in the limelight because of the global echo the attack had. So it's not because you're exploiting a vulnerability in a compromised software that we are automatically in the supply chain. So it's about modifying some lines of code in the software that is upstream, so it circulates downstream. This is a supply chain attack. So let's look at the methodology and the outcomes of the SolarWinds attack. How did the attack unfold? What's the general approach? I think we should take a snapshot here in order to have an overview of the extent of the operation. This is a three-phase approach. First phase, penetrating many IT systems simultaneously. The real targets, but why not penetrate other targets if time allows? If the targets are hard, well, it's easier to compromise one hard target that will impact every other target rather than compromising every single target individually. So the idea is to really identify one link that will impact every other entity. Then you have to validate the access you've had. So when you do such an attack, you have to really identify the targets you reached, and if these targets will allow you to really carry out the cyber attack you wanted. So you really want to then make these accesses sustainable. Then we also have to think about the measures they wanted to carry out, and this is not always obvious. It depends on the intelligence you have. So this is a very ambitious approach, and if you look clearly at each phase, well, you realize that this was indeed a tall order. The attacker wanted its attack to be extremely safe. The attacker knew that the attack would be identified. He knows he won't be able to hide for long, but he wants to leverage the time he has to carry out actions on its targets. Let's look at the timeline. So let's look at a helicopter view. In 2020, the attack had already been planified for 15 months. And we're talking also about 5 months of work without any detection for 5 months within IT systems of big corporations or government organizations. On the 8th of December, it's the US leader who gives us information, so we don't know if it's exactly at that moment that the attack was discovered. So we can reasonably imagine that this editor uncovered the attack on December the 8th. If we look at some infrastructure items that were put apart in October 2020, well, then we could wonder rightly if the editor already had information in the summer of 2020. So the timeline showcases good prep work, because between the first publication of Sunburst and the phase 2, there was only 1 month. So that was during a pandemic, so it shows that there was a lot of prep work. The transition is short, but the delay between the first intrusion of SolarWinds and the creation of Sunburst is 6 months. So there is a time between these two items, and the attackers wanted sufficient time to carry out their attack, because without this step, the attackers would not have been able to reach their target. So we still have unknowns as for the first step. How was SolarWinds identified as a potential target for the supply chain attack? Well, the number of clients, the type of clients, and everything was indicated on the editor's website. How does the attacker penetrate SolarWinds? Nothing official, but some open source research has shown that some FTP servers were only protected by a very simple password, and this information was circulated mistakenly by an intern, and this was revealed by the US Senate. As for the technical aspect, how does it unfold? So Sunspot can discreetly modify the assembly chain of SolarWinds Orion. So it's about integrating a persistent source of code in Orion. So it's about executing a process. It's the MS build process, and when the malware identifies MS build being executed, Sunspot can verify that this code is being executed, and then it can act. So if Sunspot is aware of what is unfolding, it can decipher the source code that is being executed, and it can then act and damage. So after this attack, everything is signed by SolarWinds, and the whole process seems legitimate. So we want the modification to be as undetectable as possible. We never act on when the source code of Orion is being deposited, and we don't act on the final code. We act in the middle of this chain, and it's not always supervised, at least not on the compilation process.
So let us look a little bit upwards to look at the victims and the consequences. So there was, Sunburst developed very widely. There was confusion in the media that developed about having benefited from Sunburst code, but Sunburst was deployed on a potential of tens and thousands of clients, but it doesn't mean you're going to be selected by the attacker. So the code might exist on your computer fleet, but you might not necessarily be attacked. And if you've been selected, then there'll be an additional code deployed that will be decorrelated as much as possible from sunbursts. If you look at the known targets that were confirmed by at least 2 different sources, we have U.S. governmental organizations, IT solutions suppliers, even also cybersecurity, even the energy department, for instance, that's in charge of nuclear safety. And then once there's access to emails, internal tools, very much like espionage, but the attacker tries to build trust pathways by circumventing accesses, even inter-system, inter-organization and inter-application systems. And there it's a bit blurred. So this supply chain attack that targets organizations, is it not something to access other organizations or to prepare operations? And then there's SIML signatures that gives access to third-party services that are trust-based, and then the service principles that allows for external services to access the services in internal services. So we have a Mimecast that was revealed in December that might be the result of a sunburst attack. So then we have actions on the objectives. We have relations with cobalt strike, sun shutter, etc. So it's not only sunburst that's used for the subsequent phases. Now, we're going to have a small technical interlude to give you some specificities. So sunburst is quite a specific thing. It is perfectly integrated in the product, compromised product in a legitimate context. It is hidden. The character chains are not lisible because the code conventions also are perfectly complied with. So one would think that they have been written by SolarWinds. It has a slow activation mechanism. It'll spend 12 to 14 days doing nothing in order not to generate too many new communications that might be picked up by an intelligence service. It implements a protocol that's quite original, based on DNS. So and then we have the self-defense mechanism of the code that is going to verify the environment before become executed. So to go into the detail of the command and control communication protocol, that's quite innovative. It's a simplified version because it's quite complex. It's like a state machine. Transitions are provoked by not very difficult dialogues. It can be in 2 different states: a passive state where it's at the ready and will use a controller via DNS by transmitting encoded environment information on the environment. So that's just awaiting a selection. When selected, then it's more active, HTTP with a dedicated control server, that you'll have XML files in which commands are embedded. So what about this DNS communication phase? A lot of service providers have their own DNS responder for their clients and log their DNS exchanges. That has enabled us researchers to look at all the disseminated requests that corresponded to the sunburst communication model, and we were able to spot requests that were activation requests because there's a format of response in AIM, and then to identify victims of sunburst in that fashion. So our experience on the malware has shown that by look at similarities, we have some hints on attribution, and we wanted to look at sunburst because of the media impact this case had, and we were able to identify worthwhile similarities with another malware called Kaspersky. And this was coded in the .NET like Sunburst, and it was uncovered in 2007 by Palo Alto, but the malware existed since 2015 and was. We have seen that our observations confirmed the link between Kaspersky and LUAC, and we saw Kaspersky and tools traditionally associated to TUAR. What are the similarities? Sunburst and Kaspersky have a slow release activation request. So they arrive and then they're in a latent dormant stage for a certain amount of time. And that's quite rare in malwares because attackers jump on machines and want to do their deed as fast as possible. But this kind of aleatory, calculated waiting period is similar in both malwares. Kaspersky and Sunburst use a similar technique in order to look for character keys instead of it being in a binary fashion. They have a special algorithm to hide them. They use one FNV1A with an additional stage, and this implementation, to our knowledge, only exists in Kaspersky and Sunburst. Perhaps there are other malwares using the similar system, but we don't know. But this is quite a telling example at any rate. So cryptographic identifiers that are generated, and this operator is the same between the two families, and it's not something that we have seen elsewhere. These are similarities that are quite specific to these two forms of malware. The conclusions that can be drawn from this are rather complex. We can deduct that they have benefited from a similar development, but it's not similar developer, but that's not the only possibility. For instance, they have been developed by the same people or two different people. The one that subcontracts the backdoor development. So perhaps someone working Kaspersky was moved to another organization that brought a whole load of ideas with them on the development of backdoor. So two players that are linked but different, or disjointed players that might have seen the code, one seeing the code of the other one and using it for future attacks. It's very difficult to tell what the truth is. In March 2021, Microsoft published new findings. Sun Shuttle that was deployed on the victims of the machines of victims. So once Sunburst has been activated with an interesting, worthwhile victim, then there's a second stage activation, and with this sunware they're able to penetrate more significantly. A few things on Sun Shuttle. These are different stages that are quite textbook. There's an anti-VM. That's a light layer of defense, and they check the MAC address. We don't really know why they've tried to do that. And then there's a reading or generation of the configuration. That's quite commonplace as well. Another thing that I find more interesting, to generate traffic that is false. So false requests via two legitimate receivers, and to generate legitimate traffic and have people believe that there's nothing suspicious about this type of traffic. And this is a parameter that is in all of this. And then there's negotiation of a key. And what's interesting here is that they use RSA OAEP cryptographic algorithms. They were quite sophisticated in doing so. It mightn't have been optimal, but these are lesser known algorithms. And once all of this has been done, we're in the main, the core of the program, where they can undertake a number of actions, but not very developed. That were the possibility of download files, send files that have been stolen from the victim. So all the development budget of Sun Shuttle has not been placed in advanced functions on the machines of the victims, but on development capacity so as not to be detected by the victims, to sneak in to the victims' machines. So we have a Nobelium or Dark Halo. So after the revelations in March 2021, the track stopped there. There haven't been a whole lot of developments since then. But we'll fast forward to June 2021, when it would appear, it appeared that the dust had settled on SolarWinds. We were working on an attack on a government in Central Asia. So it was DNS hijacking. Now what's that? We are going to explain the DNS protocol a little bit so that you can understand it. It's very useful. On the internet, you use domain names, for instance, google.com. If you want to get onto Facebook, facebook.com. But for a computer, in order to connect somewhere, it needs an IP address. For that to work, you need a service that converts all these domain names into IP addresses. And that happens through huge, giant directories. So if someone wants to go on a site.com, we can ask, one asks an authoritative server to see who to go to for a certain amount of information. Not everything can be stored in one and the same place. So you go to an authoritative server, and that server is going to say, ask such and such, because they know. And then the user can ask this new server, I know you know where this.com is situated. Can you give me the address? And then there'll be an answer. Go on the 1, 2, 3, 4 IP site, and then the user connects onto that and is in the right place. Let us suppose that an attacker is able to interfere with this authoritative server. It's less complicated than you might think. And you have a domain name that might have been sold on. And if someone, for instance, buys this identity, it's very easy to do. So if that happens, the new server that will be indicated to ask the question will be taken hold of by the attacker. And so instead of saying 1, 2, 3, 4 as the IP address, might say 11, 12, 13, 14. And that would be a site controlled by the attacker. So anyone trying to connect to it will be redirected to that new address. And that's very worthwhile for the attacker, because from the point of view of the network architecture, the true legitimate site is the one that is controlled by the attacker. So there's been a displacement, a replacement, if you like. So let us see how that can be used by the attacker to conduct attacks. So imagine all all users of mail.gov are redirected to a site that he or she creates. And this is what happened. The attackers created new sites that looked like government mail websites, very akin to the original. And all the victims had to do is to connect to their legitimate webmail and type in their password, and the victims were bereft of any protection because they're not able to defend themselves. They're on the legitimate website. And then the attack had put in first an error message that, and you see it in red, asking users to download a security update, Tomeris. It's not very complicated malware. It doesn't have a whole lot of functions. What it does is to download programs on the internet and execute them on the local machine. But while one was working on Tomeris, we saw similarities between that and Sun Shuttle, and we thought that this program might have been developed using the same generic design, and the way the functions were spread out across the program, etc., was quite similar. So the two forms of malware are Tomeris and Chimgo. And if we look at Sun Shuttle as well, we have the feeling that the developmental approach was similar. There were programming errors that were common to both, especially the pseudo-random generators, the way they were used. There were thumbnail problems in both forms of malware. But there's no, what we thought that Tomeris might have been developed by the same ones as Sun Shuttle, and this cannot be considered to be a certainty at this stage. So it's an informed opinion, but not a confirmation. Should this be confirmed, the timeline might indicate that Tomeris is the successor of Sun Shuttle, developed at the beginning of 2021. And this is a very interesting illustration how the ATP react to the capture of their backdoor. So a few months after this media storm, this particular player was, via hijacking of a DNS, was able to attack once again. As we saw at the beginning, between Sun Shuttle and Kaspersky and Sunburst, there's a weak link with the FNVAA algorithm, the management of identifiers. It's a weak link, does not enable us to link the two families together, but there is a link nonetheless. And based upon what I just said, one might say that between Sun Shuttle and Tomeris there might be similar development practices, i.e. they have been created by developers who share the same way of working. And we can add a little link there between Kaspersky and Tomeris that is based upon the fact that we discovered Kaspersky and Tomeris on the same victims network. We don't have this causal link. We don't have a smoking gun that would enable us to say that one was deployed onto the network thanks to the other. We know that both were present, but it might be two independent attacks. So there's a weak link, and we have the feeling that there might be a little bit of evidence that will enable us to attribute all these attacks to the same attacker, Dark Halo or Sun Shuttle. We might be able to do this at some point in time.
On n'y est pas complètement.
So we have not managed that. We are still collecting items that tie into the tools we've discovered in the SolarWinds attack. I believe we have a number of things we can still identify. As for the technical aspect, via comparisons, but also through further investigation. So we don't have much time left. So I'd like to give you a couple of outlooks. What's the final effect, the final sought after effect? Well, it was a espionage attack. So the targets were really quite difficult to identify. We're not only I'm not convinced it was only about espionage. It could have been about other targets also. It could also be about destabilizing the US. This attack was carried out during a pandemic, during a political transition in the US. So the destabilizing effect can be considered as a target. That was a supply chain attack, and that was also a reminder to many actors in the branch that this is a highly effective attack, and that a supply chain is increasingly difficult to master, because we often tend to outsource and hire third parties. So this was really a reminder that some attacks can have devastating effects if they target the supply chain. This was also a very accurate and well-prepared attack. The attacker was determined and was not going to stop after being uncovered, and it also very sophisticated and discreet. It remained during 1 year inside the devices of the US government and the digital giants. So this is extremely difficult to accomplish, and it shows that the actors at hand were highly sophisticated. So how can you protect yourself against such attacks? Well, it's highly complex. You could do that at the level of software developers or IT solution developers. They have to be aware of the role of the clientele, the fact that these clients can be targeted, and that's not always obvious, especially if you're an indirect target that can lead to a supply chain attack. So another approach is to work with trust building tools. So we could work with labelization, audit or control mechanisms. But I think all in all, you have to be aware that external tools should have a limited access to your IT system. So you have to silo your system, especially when you're calling upon third-party tools. As for the telemetry, well, there's nothing new from a technical standpoint. There's nothing that was unheard of in the whole series of malware or APT that we showed you. However, it's very complex, and you really have to be able to act on a number of levels in order to respond to such an attack, because the attack was really well decorrelated. So it's about working on your own capacities, detection capacities and response capacities. You have to implement traceability and look at the different pathways that were taken by the attacker. That's it for us. We've reached the end of our presentation. Do you have a question? So if you have other questions, you can pay us a visit at the Kaspersky stall in the forum. Thank you very much.
Ok, super. Par contre, si jamais, est-ce que vous pouvez poser...
So, are there any questions? We have time for one question. Yes.
Bon, pas de questions maintenant, c'est pas grave. Hein. Ah si, voilà.
No questions? Yes, there is one question. So, in the framework of this DNS attack, would a DNS stack authentication protect the server? Good question. I have to look at how DNSSEC works. I don't know if the authoritative servers have been signed. Well, short answer is no. The way we introduced it, of course you can wonder about this, but for our use case, the most common case is control that is seized on the administration dashboard. So it's a DNS attack, but it's really about taking control of domain names, and that they're automatically modified in the panel. So what's published is always done by valid servers provided by authorities that were the same ones as the previous ones. So if a registration was signed, they would have also been signed. So it's the same with Sunburst. The code that comes out is signed and is emitted by SolarWinds. Thank you very much, and remember that we are at the forum for the next days.